Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need.
Today is October 7th, marking a year of Israel using the Hamas attacks to justify their genocide of the Palestinian people. 1 year where Western nations have funded and supported the brutalization of a people while suppressing those who dare to speak out. A year where they have amassed the levers of power, showing that the systems that many believe could bring change are nothing more than an illusion. It is clear in their blatant disregard for international law, their persecutions of activists, students, and of all of those who raise their voice in protest. Today, we welcome back Dimitri Lascaris, who brings stories from recent trips to Lebanon, analysis of escalations with Iran, a discussion on the right to armed resistance, and a reaction to Elizabeth May's antics in the House. We have a lot to talk about, so let's jump right in.
Dimitri Lascaris is back with us. Welcome back, Dimitri. Introduce yourself to people who live under a rock.
I think a lot more people than those under the rock don't know who I am, but I do appreciate that sentiment. And first of all, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to talk to you both. Always a pleasure. And I'm a lawyer, practiced many years, starting back in the 90s, and I'm a freelance journalist, a former political candidate in Canada. And nowadays, my primary preoccupation is journalism, and particularly reporting from conflict zones.
Speaking of conflict zones, you recently came back from Lebanon, and that is going to be a large focus of the discussion today, considering the most current events, rockets going back and forth and whatnot. We will unpack all of that and the political ramifications and the global response to that. But what was your trip like to Lebanon? And it wasn't just one trip, was it?
Yeah. So the first trip I did is 4 trips altogether since October 7th of last year, since the attacks by Palestinian militants in Israel. And the first trip I did a week after the attacks in middle October. I have a home here in Greece where I am now, where I spend several months a year. I was here at the time, and as soon as the attacks happened, and we began to hear this extremely alarming language coming out of the mouths of leaders in Israel, I just felt I had to do something, and so I got on a plane and I went to Beirut after I heard that Hassan Nasrallah, who was recently assassinated, had called for a day of rage in Lebanon. So this was intended to be protests. So I got on a plane within like 24 hours of hearing about this day of rage, and I flew into Beirut. I was told that the main protest was going to be at the U.S. Embassy. So I immediately got in a taxi. I dropped my suitcase at my hotel and then went to the embassy. And when I got there, it was complete and utter mayhem. There were running battles between thousands of protesters and Lebanese soldiers, the regular army. And there were rubber bullets flying, and there were rocks being thrown. So to my surprise, a lot of Lebanese soldiers were picking up the rocks and throwing them back at the protesters. A lot of tear gas. A building was set on fire very close to the embassy. And I saw one young man, tragically, who he had received a tear gas canister in the eye, and his eye had been displaced from its socket, and he went by me on a motorcycle heading towards a hospital. So it was quite an introduction to the current situation in Lebanon. And then at that point, I had to hire a fixer, because you can't go into South Lebanon. It's impossible to go into South Lebanon in current conditions all the way back to October without having a local who is trusted by Hezbollah to accompany you. So I hired a journalist from Al Mayadeen, the journalist out at the news network It was founded by former Al Jazeera journalists who were very unhappy with Al Jazeera's coverage of the war in Syria. It was founded back in 2012. I had a mutual friend. Al-Mayadeen, safe to say, is sympathetic to Hezbollah and trusted by Hezbollah. So I paid him out of my own pocket because I'm not paid to do journalism by anybody. And he accompanied me to South Lebanon after he got permits for us to go south of the Litani River, which is where it's the hot zone between the Litani River and the Israeli border. And when we were down there, there were regular explosions, and you could hear drones constantly overhead. We rarely saw the drones because Hezbollah has some capacity to shoot them down, but if they're at a very high altitude, they can't with the equipment that they currently have. And very frequently we heard fighter jets overhead. But you never saw them. You heard them, and sometimes there were sonic booms, and occasionally there were explosions. And we saw some artillery shells landing on the other side of the border. From where we were, we could see 2 Israeli military bases almost all the time. One is called Metula, and the other is called Al-Manada. And they have taken the brunt of the attacks from Hezbollah in this conflict. So that was the first time. And the second time, and basically, I'm not going to summarize, what happened on each trip because that would take too much time. But basically, from that point on, the situation became increasingly violent, and it became increasingly difficult for me to access South Lebanon, and increasingly dangerous. So my fourth trip, I did another trip in early 2024. Then I went back in May, and my most recent trip was in August. There, I was actually not supposed to be allowed south of the Litani River because Hezbollah decided they would only allow journalists who were affiliated with a major media organization. And even then, it depended on the media organization, and I'm a freelancer. So ultimately, my enterprising fixer found a way to get me south of the Litani River anyways. And we went all the way to the border again. And this time, there were the level of combat was much higher. I mean, you could see explosions going off in the distance, both on the Lebanese and the Israeli side of the border. You heard them often, and you could many times see the actual blast and the smoke rising from the blast site, dozens of times a day. And, it was very dangerous to approach the border. I'll just relate to you one incident in my last trip, which I thought was really sort of instructive, and that was there's a village called Ait Shab, it's a Lebanese village. I would guess it's got a population of about 10,000 before the war. It's 1 kilometer from the Israeli border. There is an Israeli military base on a hill overlooking, maybe no more than 1 or 2 kilometers from the border of Israel, overlooking Ait Shab. The village has been evacuated, and the only reason we were able to get in there was because a Hezbollah fighter from the village had been killed by a drone strike the day before, and so the villagers went back for his funeral. And so there was a 2-hour period. We went in with the funeral convoy, and there was a 2-hour period where we had access to the village, and the level of destruction I saw was astonishing, absolutely astonishing. I would say it's probably comparable to what you're seeing in Gaza. And from what I could tell, the vast majority, I didn't really see anything that looked like a military structure having been destroyed. It looked to me like houses, small apartment buildings, commercial shops. And the thing that really struck me about this is that the villagers who were there were, I thought it was extraordinary courage for these people to come and celebrate, to pay homage to a Hezbollah fighter in the current circumstances. And there were women, children.
Especially with that position, the enemy is elevated only a kilometer away.
And drones overhead and fighter jets were flying overhead. In fact, at one point during the funeral, the Israeli fighter jets, accelerated, and we heard a sonic boom. I think that was intended to scare people. But the people there, at the level of hospitality and their steadfastness, the smiling and, the warmth, I was astonished. You would think there wasn't a war going on. And I think that they collectively feel that it's their responsibility to show by their behavior every minute of the day that they are not intimidated, and they will not be, they won't even allow themselves to feel fear. I'm sure they do feel fear, but they have made a collective decision that they're not going to give the enemy the comfort of showing their fear. and allowing themselves to become less humane than they normally would be. So that made quite an impression on me, I have to say.
I have to ask, just because it's of how many journalists have been killed by Israel, including journalists in South Lebanon. Were you concerned for your safety and for your life when you were there?
Sure, there wasn't a moment when I was in South Lebanon on any of those trips, but particularly the last trip, when I didn't think, I could be killed at any minute, in an instant, without even knowing that I'm about to die, because it happened so fast. I could have my legs, blown off. But I guess you kind of relativize it by looking at the people around you and realizing that they have to deal with this every minute of the day. Whereas I have the privilege of briefly entering into this dangerous situation and exiting at my pleasure, and coming to a place like where I am now, where I don't have to deal with any of this. And that's where I spend 95% of my time, in a very secure environment. And the other thing is, I've had a very good life. I consider myself to have had in many ways, a privileged life, although I didn't come from a wealthy family. Still, as a Westerner and somebody who was in the legal profession, I've had a very privileged life. And I'm not saying this to sound, it really is how I feel. It's like, if I died tomorrow in the cause of truth telling, that wouldn't be a bad way to go. And I wouldn't be saying to myself, my life was cut short. I'm pretty old now. I'm not a young person who does this. I think that's something that's truly amazing. Someone who has their whole life ahead of them and puts themselves in that situation voluntarily. That's courage. That's amazing. But, I'm an old guy.
I'm not going to comment on that, but I do want to go back to you experiencing that joy as a form of resistance. And I think we've seen that in our Palestinian comrades over the last year. They even say as much, when they smile in the face of all of this still. Surely, if they can, we can, right? But that is a form of resistance, you're right. And to live and breathe it while yourself being terrified, surely you gain some strength from those folks. Now, before we started recording, you spoke of an evolution within, not a revolution, an evolution within Lebanon over the past year. Your story started off with regular Lebanese armed forces in conflict with protesters who had been called onto the streets by Hezbollah. Can you speak to that a little bit more? Is that changed? Has the feeling amongst regular folks in Lebanon, not members of Hezbollah, is the resistance kind of within them as well? I mentioned this because I was talking to Santiago earlier, brushing up on my history of Lebanon, and, the way the casualties were listed from the 2006 war, July war. In Lebanon, they refused to differentiate between civilian and soldier or a combatant. The casualties are one and the same. They are all martyrs. Is that true? Like, when you speak to people on the ground in Lebanon, do they feel as though they are inherently part of the resistance, just doing everyday things?
Well, Lebanon is, as I'm sure you know, a very complex country. One of the things I've come to love that country, and one of the reasons why I do, is because it's kind of a miracle that country still exists in some form that you can, I guess, reasonably describe as a state. But there's tremendous sectarianism and diversity of opinion. So I remember the first trip, my fixer had to hire. My fixer was from Beirut. She actually works part-time for Radio Canada. She's a Lebanese Canadian. But now she's based in Beirut, and she couldn't drive us around South Lebanon. She had to hire a driver. Our driver, I think it's fair to say, was sympathetic to Hezbollah. I think it's right. He had a very high opinion of Hezbollah. He spoke pretty good English. And, one of the places he took us was a village called Marjayun, which is a Maronite Christian village just a couple of kilometers from the border. And when we drove through the village, there were people coming out of the church, the main church, and we stopped and we spoke to them. And sort of like the community elder agreed to do an interview. And I was asking him, what do you feel about what is being done to the Palestinian people? And he refused to condemn Israel. He didn't praise Israel. He didn't condemn Israel. He just said, it's really not for us to decide. This is a conflict between them. And however much I tried to get him to say something critical of Israel, he wouldn't. And the whole time, the driver who was standing next to me was just shaking his head. He was absolutely disgusted. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. And then, within hours, we went to a town called Cana, which is predominantly Shia Muslim. That's the base of Hezbollah. So it's not exclusively who supports Hezbollah by any means, but mostly Shia Muslims support Hezbollah. And this was the site of 2 Israeli massacres. They killed dozens of people who were sheltering at a UN compound. And I interviewed people there, and it was a totally different story. It was, this is a fight to the death. We will sacrifice everything. The Zionists will not defeat us. I'm prepared to give my life. That was the kind of sentiments that I heard. So, you get, and then there are people, the phalanges, for example, who are many Lebanese regard as, extreme right-wing fascists, and they call themselves Christians, who are decidedly pro-Israel. I personally never talked to anybody. I never found anybody who said good things about Israel, but they exist in the Lebanese society, to be sure. But having said that, over the course of the 4 trips, I found the level of unity it's just, of course, this is my own personal feeling. I didn't do any polls, so I can just tell you anecdotally how I felt. I felt that the level of unity was increasing. And there were objective signs of this. For example, the leader of the Druze, who normally would not stand side to side with the leaders of Hezbollah, came out and supported them in their acts of resistance. And then I met a lot of people who are Christian Lebanese who are sympathetic to the Syrian National Socialist, the Syrian National Social Party, SSNP, who are passionately supportive of anybody who is involved in resisting the Israelis and their aggression and what's being done to the Palestinians, whether it be Hezbollah, whether it be Amal, whether it be Sunni groups, they don't care. So I felt that the level of unity was going up, the level of combat was increasing intensely, the level of danger went up enormously. And I also, the last thing I'll say is that we're very, very candid about the fact that they were afraid. They were very afraid. And they didn't hesitate in telling me this, in Beirut, of the war and of escalation. And they, time and again, people talk to me about what happened in 2006 and the horrors. So, but as I got closer to the border, there were less and less sort of overt signs or admissions that, of fear.
Since then, the losses that they've incurred in Lebanon almost match that of the 2006 war. So
yes,
they had every right to kind of be afraid.
I mean, even before the current round of savagery, I completely understood their fear. Absolutely. After what the Lebanese people have experienced, they had every reason to be fearful.
Yeah. So myself personally, my background is half Lebanese. My dad grew up in Lebanon in the 80s during the Civil War. I got to visit in 2019, and he actually wrote a book talking all about like his experiences as a child, like during the Civil War, and the Lebanon you're describing now versus the Lebanon that I saw 5 years ago in 2019 sounds so very different. Like for example, just getting south of the river, like back then was just as easy as renting a car and driving. The signs of war of the past were everywhere, but they were from the past, and you could see how things had changed in the country since then. The healing I felt that there was, just talking with my dad about like how he felt Lebanon had changed since when he was there, about how a lot of those old sectarian lines had healed in quite a large amount since the 80s. And it's actually interesting. My family, Maronite Christians from Babda, and but a lot of my closer relatives who formerly held such beliefs have now been very critical of Israel and supportive of Hezbollah. So even that is starting to change given everything that we're seeing. And it's just, I don't even know what question I want to ask necessarily about this, but I'm honestly very emotional just listening to all of this and like thinking about like, because like with Palestine, obviously it's been absolutely horrible, but it's all been filtered through a screen. And here it's something where I can like imagine these towns, these villages, because I've seen them with my own eyes, and it's so difficult for me to comprehend what's going on. And
Yeah, and I didn't even mention. I'm sure you know this, Santiago, the economic crisis in the country. I mean, they get electricity 2 hours a day. They've got hyperinflation. Even when you're walking around relatively affluent parts of Beirut, you'll see mothers with their babies begging in the streets. This was before this genocidal war began, which is now being waged on Lebanon. And again, I can't believe, I'm amazed, I'm awestruck by the resilience of these people. It's truly something to behold. You want to find out what courage is, go to Lebanon. You'll find out real damn fast.
The economic hardships in the state of Lebanon, as you describe it, I think some of us wonder, even though you can't tell by mainstream media narratives, calling them terrorists and so astonished that Iran would dare fire rockets or Lebanon would do the same. But I wonder if that situation that they have there is part of the restraint that we've actually seen, considering, what you've described in the south of Lebanon, the way life has changed for them. And after the latest rounds of assassinations of Hezbollah leaders, you have over 250,000 now displaced inside Lebanon, over 1,000 dead. And still, I would say the response to those atrocities has been pretty restrained. Yet still they are demonized for having any kind of response to the Israeli aggression that they're experiencing. I think it's also just before we've had an episode on Lebanon before, but if folks didn't catch that and they're not aware, Israel has occupied Lebanon many times, and there are still small parts of Lebanon that are still under Israeli occupation, according to Lebanese people. And it's just to help explain the kinship that exists there, to explain why Hezbollah sees this as a fight to the death and why there's such a relation to the Palestinian cause. It's really one and the same. We do spend a lot of time talking about that, and I'll link that episode back where we speak to Mohammed, whose family right now is in Lebanon, his mother and his father, both likely to be displaced again, and, has family opening up restaurants to feed the displaced people. So there's people in Canada here that are very well connected to what's happening in Lebanon right now, and certainly worried about even greater escalation, considering the U.S. position on it all. But to the point about restraint, Jessa, I mean, the BBC just did an analysis which showed that 80% of the military operations have been launched by Israel. Okay, 80% of all military operations since October of last year. The number of dead civilians, I think probably at this stage, it's well over 1,000. I won't even talk about the wounded. On the Israeli side, I believe the number, if you exclude the children, which are something like 12 children who were killed tragically at Majd al-Sabs in the Syrian Golan Heights, which has been stolen by Israel from Syria. If you exclude them, I think there's been two
2 civilian casualties on the Israeli side. This is the Israeli figures. Okay, so who is the aggressor here? Who is showing a lack of restraint? Are you kidding me? You're going to tell me it's Hezbollah, which is the aggressor and is showing a lack of restraint, and the other side is not only killing far more Lebanese and destroying far more infrastructure, but they're committing a damn genocide, for God's sakes. And the resistance in Lebanon has been clear that they'll stop attacking military targets, which is what they're attacking. I saw one myself. I saw a Hezbollah attack on Metula with a thermobaric missile and artillery shells. Okay, they were very precise. They were hitting a military base, and that's what they've been doing. And it's this narrative in the West that Israel is defending itself against terrorism from Lebanon is an insult to our intelligence. It's an absolute insult to our intelligence. These people are trying to stop a genocide. And one thing I want to say about the restraint which they have shown and the Iranians have shown, we need to understand that they have their own constituencies. The leadership of Hezbollah can't only think about the Palestinian people as much as they care about their destiny. They also have to think about the people who have empowered them. And those people, as much as they have suffered up until now, they haven't suffered the level of depravity that the people of Gaza have had to experience over the last year. And Israel is perfectly capable of doing to Lebanon what it has done to Gaza. So they've been walking this very, very delicate line, very fine line, trying to cause enough damage to Israeli military bases in the north that Israel is required to divert military resources to the north, away from Gaza, away from the West Bank. They've been trying to degrade Israel's surveillance capacities. A lot of their attacks have been on surveillance equipment and radars. They are trying to do economic damage to Israel, and they have. I mean, all of those people who have had to leave northern Israel are being maintained at government expense in Tel Aviv and other parts further south. And the economy has taken a huge hit because the economy of northern Israel is basically, it's comatose. There is no economy. All the shops have been shut down. So through a variety of ways, they are helping to weaken Israel and divert Israel's resources away from Gaza and the West Bank. But if they go too far, their country will become Gaza. It's as simple as that. That is a very, very difficult line to walk. And they did it for as long as they could. And I think it finally got to the point where the Israelis, their economy is a mess. It's an absolute basket case. And they have not managed to defeat Hamas, which is a humiliation for them. So they finally said, okay, well, to hell with it. We don't care whether they're being restrained. We're going to ignite an all-out war with Hezbollah. And I want to just be absolutely clear, because this has to be said over and over again, this crap we've been hearing from the American government, that they didn't know that they were going to kill Nasrallah. I mean, what are we, children? They think we believe this crap? They killed the leader of Hezbollah, potentially igniting attacks on American military bases. Israel requires, the support of the United States for its very existence. And Netanyahu, who was in New York, he was in the United States at the time, didn't even have the courtesy to tell his American compadres, oh, we're going to go massacre, hundreds of civilians for the purpose of killing Nasrallah. Okay, they knew. Not only did they knew, they helped him. They helped him, and an article just came out in Politico, which said, behind the scenes, the Biden administration was supporting Israel's escalations. Okay, so this is an American genocide. This is an American massacre that's taking place every day in Lebanon. It is the Americans who are behind all this. Israel is a giant American military base masquerading as a country. That's the way to think of it.
One thing that was really telling for me over the last couple of days was how, the U.S. ships in the area were launching interceptor missiles to protect Israel from attacks from Iran, right? Now, they've been talking all of this big game about, wanting peace and wanting a ceasefire and yada, yada. Feasibly, and I'm not naive enough to believe that they ever would, but feasibly, they could have also used similar technologies to stop attacks from Israel into Lebanon or into Gaza. Now, obviously, they would never do that, but the quickness with which they always defend Israel, and yet they talk about wanting peace and wanting a ceasefire, their actions are the loudest thing always. And
absolutely. Their words words mean nothing. They mean nothing. Their word is mud. No one should believe a damn word. In fact, I'm going to give you I'm sorry to interrupt you, Santiago, but just to give you a sense of how skeptical, this is how skeptical I think people should be. Okay? Netanyahu, he goes to New York, and we're told the reason for him going there is he's going to go flap his gums at the UN General Assembly. Okay? Now you stop and you think, I didn't think about this at the time. I just believed it like a fool. Oh yeah, he's going to New York. He wants to be on the big stage. He's going to go speak to an empty hall. That's Netanyahu. But 2 days later, I thought to myself, what if this was just a cover story? And the real reason why he was there was because he and the Americans were about to execute an extraordinarily dangerous and devastating military operation in Beirut. Is it a coincidence that Netanyahu was in the United States when the bomb started falling on Nasrallah's head, wiping out 6 residential apartment towers? Maybe. Maybe it was a coincidence, but I don't think so. These people are pathological liars, and the Americans want this war. They want war with Iran, not just with Hezbollah. That should be our operating assumption.
Sorry, I'm giggling because Santiago and I had this kind of conversation, and really, it's hard to understand, though, that why the Americans would want to go to what would likely be such a devastating conflict, war with Iran. But it's really hard to interpret all of this as anything but. And to then turn around and classify Iran's most recent strikes on Israel, I think is just displays the farce for what it is. They've allowed Benjamin Netanyahu to play that dance for so long, right, to his benefit, to maintain power in Israel, as though he's a defiant leader. He even flexes his muscles against the mighty U.S., right? It allows him to gain that kind of bravado when we all understand that behind the scenes, no one breathes in the Israeli military unless the Americans are aware of it. I mean, they're funding it, they're facilitating it. They would need to back them up should anything go awry. They have assets in all of these places that would need to be avoided, and the communication would just definitely be happening before it ever happened. And so it's all just this play on display for us, but it's quite convincing for a lot of Canadians, for example, who have totally bought into the narrative that Hezbollah is nothing but a terrorist organization, Hamas the same, for a bunch of nefarious reasons. The media feeds into this, but our political leaders feed into that. But I mean, we all have been taught, or most of us have been taught, what crimes against humanity are. And we even have gotten our leaders to kind of acknowledge that there is a genocide ongoing, that there is crimes against humanity being committed. But yet, never in the narrative is the underlying premise that we all hold responsibility to respond in the way Iran has. Now, I don't know if you want to make the point, Santiago, but that Iran didn't actually respond for Gaza. Even though I'll admit, when I saw videos of the rockets hitting Israeli air bases, I had concerns that there'd be civilian deaths because those deaths would be weaponized. But I did feel a sense of joy, of a finally someone is using these goddamn weapons that they've hoarded for so long and deprived their people of funds so they can have these armed forces, all of them, all these fucking states with all these armies, and yet none of them are using them for good. None of them are even pretending that they're going to use these weapons they've accumulated to stop women and children from being slaughtered en masse, in front of our fucking eyes. And so, I don't know. I hope it's not right to watch airstrikes or missiles flying and being like, and feeling a sense of like relief, or it wasn't dread I really felt that, like, and we should, right? When we see people trading weaponry like this, we should not feel anything but kind of disappointment, at least, that it's gotten to this point. But what else can the global community do other than fight back at this point? I don't know.
Well, look at it this way. I don't think if I'm asking you the question rhetorically. I think I know what your answer is. But imagine we were alive during the time of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and as the uprising was occurring, and the Nazis were brutally massacring Jewish people who were trying to break out of a death camp and simply, obtain their freedom and save their children from certain death and torture. The Soviet army or the Americans or the British started bombing the bejesus out of the Gestapo's headquarters in Warsaw. I think there'd be a lot of cheering in the West. People would say, go get them, wipe them out, destroy those Nazis. Okay, well, right now there's a death camp. There's a death camp in Gaza. That's what this thing has become. Hundreds of thousands of people possibly have been wiped out. At a bare minimum, it's 40, 50,000 people. And the number is growing by the day. And these people have basically, to say they're treated like subhumans is an insult to subhumans. I mean, it's unspeakable what's being done to them. So why should we apologize if somebody has the courage, at great risk to themselves, to attack the military forces that are annihilating them and torturing them with glee, and bragging about it to the entire world? I'm not going to apologize for that. I would prefer, as I'm sure you would, that this all be solved peacefully. And there's a simple way to do it. Joe Biden picks up the phone and he says to that psychopathic war criminal Netanyahu, no more bombs for you, baby. And the thing is done. It's over. But Genocide Joe won't do that. So what is the alternative? All of our protests? What have they accomplished? What have our protests accomplished? Nothing. Has Justin Trudeau stopped sending weapons to Israel? No, he hasn't stopped. Has he stopped giving charitable status to organizations like the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, which is whitewashing a genocide? No. Has he stopped voting in favor of Israel at the United Nations? No. So the protests aren't working. They've not accomplished a damn thing. What's left? The only thing that's left is armed resistance. That's all that's left. That's the only way the Palestinian people would be saved. And I'm not going to apologize, nor should you or anybody else, for supporting armed resistance against not terrorism, armed resistance against the military that is committing a genocide before the eyes of the world.
It almost sucks that we still have to say the word like not terrorism when like it's very clear who's attacking civilian targets and who only attacks military targets. Like it's I wanted to ask, last time you were on was around the era of like the ICJ rulings, and back then you were quite optimistic about international law being able to do something about the genocide. I hate to ask, but like months later, how are you feeling about that very same issue?
I underestimated the depravity of our governments. I really did. As you guys know, before this all began in October of last year, I was very critical of Western governments. Even I did not think they were this sick and deranged. I thought that if the ICJ says it's plausible that Israel's committing genocide, at least some of them would begin to impose sanctions on Israel. At least some of them would stop sending weapons to Israel. None of them has done that. Not any of the major suppliers from the West. Not Germany, not Britain, not France, not Canada, not the United States, not Australia. Okay? So this is a level of depravity that I had not understood. At this stage, I don't think that there is anything that any international court or tribunal could do. There's nothing, I hate to say this, that civil society can do that will cause our governments to stop supporting this monstrous regime. Nothing. I mean, can you imagine worse atrocities than those that we have witnessed, than those that we know to have taken place? I can't. So if they're not going to pull the plug on Israel in the face of those atrocities, Why should we think that other atrocities will finally cause them to have a human conscience? They have no conscience, these people. They have no conscience. So yeah, I'm very skeptical about the international legal system being able to alter the behavior of Western governments.
You talk about them not having a conscience, and like no one's arguing with you here at all. But they have a fucking constituency, right? You talk about Hezbollah having to walk a fine line, right? Because they're afraid they're not going to be in power if they make the wrong move, right? If they are too much on a one issue item, whatever, even if that is a genocide just next door to them. And yet, what the fuck is going on here in Canada that our politicians don't feel like they've got a constituency to answer to? Because the response that the politicians have felt and the polls that they're reading all tell them that the people that they've got to answer to at the ballot are not in favor of their actions, right? Are horrified. So as we stand now, maybe civil society can't do shit about that, clearly, because like we've haunted them at their lunches, their fundraisers, everywhere they turn, they're faced with Palestinian solidarity activists trying to remind them that there's going to be a price politically to pay. That hasn't been enough, clearly, because they're still operating as though they don't have a constituency to answer, or that we won't hold them accountable at the ballot box. And if that's the case, if that's not even going to be a Canadian federal election item at all, that we are going to force to the issue, then yes, all hope is lost. But it's really frustrating to hear that, like, the leaders of Iran and Hezbollah and all these other places are walking these fine political lines, and ours are just like fucking plowing through with genocide, and we're just pinging off the side of them like we aren't voters. Well, I'm not really anymore, but it's our political system so fucked that even can exist, that all of these mainstream parties, it wouldn't really matter. Those weapons would likely still be going. So, yeah, incredibly frustrating.
I have to push back on one thing, though. And it pains me to do it, Jess, but this idea that we're going to hold them accountable at the ballot box. I mean, look at the polls. Who's in the lead by a wide margin? Who is going to win a stunning majority if an election were held today? The most radical, pro-genocide, fucking unconscionable liar, pro-Israel liar on the Canadian political scene, Pierre Poilievre. So if you're a Canadian politician and you're looking at the polls, so why would you think that your support for Israel is going to harm your chances at winning? It's not harming Pierre.
That's a good point. That's a good point, but I would argue that the cons have taken a position. So they're going to capture folks who they're going to capture. I get it. But there is no alternate position. It's wishy-washy. I'm not going to give the NDP credit for shit. I'm really not going to give May credit for what she's saying in the House of Commons right now. It's a year past. I'm so pissed off with them now. So, but like to voters that are working every minute now against the genocide, doing whatever the hell they can, have nothing. So they've lost. Like, there's got to be political ramifications for the NDP and the Liberals, who try to play themselves as they would be the humanitarian choice, right? The bleeding heart Liberals and the progressive NDP. They should be an alternate for people to go there, for people to witness a genocide, our inaction, and then have somewhere to go politically. But there's nowhere. So all of those people are off in the fucking wind when it comes to E-Day. They're not working politically, but they're not going to be knocking doors for the Liberals or the NDPs. There's no fucking way. And they haven't gone to the Conservatives either. And the most people who, when we're talking E-Day, most people don't vote at all. So we're talking about a shit ton of people who have no political home because there's no impact, because it seems futile. So I'm not telling people to go out and vote for the NDP. That's not my solution.
Right. So I readily accept that there are millions of Canadians of conscience out there who are very upset about what's being done to the Palestinian people. And, I honor them all. I'm proud of them all. I identify with these people. And there are many of them right across the country. But the fact of the matter is that most Canadians don't particularly care. Not enough, at any rate. They may think, oh, this is terrible. I wish it wasn't happening. Israel isn't quite the country that I thought it was. But are they actually going to change their vote because the major parties all support a genocide?
No, they won't change their vote. They probably won't vote at all.
Yeah, that's something that concerns these people. But at the end of the day, whatever influence the voting public may have from time to time on, the political parties in Canada, I happen to ascribe to the view, and maybe it's simplistic, that they're just vassals of the United States government, and they're going to do what the U.S. tells them to do. As simple as that. If Joe Biden tomorrow imposed sanctions on Israel, I guarantee you within 48 hours, Canada would impose sanctions on Israel. The Israel lobby be damned. Trudeau would do what Biden tells him to do. And that's ultimately what's driving this. It's not the ballot box. Our government is a slavish vassal of Washington. I'm afraid that it's as simple as that. But I just want to say something else, Jessica, because this sounds very negative, okay? I actually am I can't stress this enough. I'm actually very optimistic about the future of West Asia, and particularly the Palestinian people, because I believe that Israel is going to be defeated strategically by the resistance. I have no doubt in my mind about this. Israel cannot survive in its current form. The people of the region are fed up. They now have the capacity to inflict enough military and economic pain on Israel that Israel will not survive. People are leaving the country. The economy is a disaster. It's getting worse by the day. The Israeli people are coming to the conclusion that it is not, in fact, a sanctuary for the for the Jewish people after all. And whatever they may feel about Palestinians, they're going to vote with their feet. They're going to say, I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to be part of this because I don't feel safe here. And that's happening right now. So ultimately, I think that they will prevail. And the thing that breaks my heart and breaks the heart of everybody is that a lot of people are going to die before it happens. That's the reality. And I think the bloodshed is about to become much worse, and it's going to expand well beyond Palestine and Lebanon. So that's the heartbreaking part of this. But do I believe that they're going to be defeated? Not for 1 second. And I'm not like the kind of person, like before, I'll tell you, I was more pessimistic about the future of the Palestinian people before this war began. Everybody was writing them off. They did the Abraham Accords, and the Americans moved their embassy to Jerusalem, and they recognized Israel's illegal theft of the Golan Heights, and the Saudis were on the verge of normalizing. Now the game has changed completely. Israel is finished. But it's not going to be because of our governments. It's going to be despite our governments.
That's maddening. What the fuck are these people going to tell their children what they did? What are they going to tell their children what they did? I
ask myself that question every day, Jessa. Every day.
But there's so many people. Really, what the fuck are you going to tell your kids? It's not even the politicians, just the Canadians that you spoke of that just don't care enough to even change their vote or, do something a little more drastic than change their vote. It's maddening, but I want to push back. It's hard to say that a continuing year of genocide has seen any progress. But I think what the movements here have accomplished is immeasurable. It has not stopped the bombs or the genocide, but it will help delegitimize the state of Israel, right? It is creating a form of resistance within these states, regardless of how our governments act right now. But the idea of a legitimate state, Zionist state, an ethno-state that is brutal to its neighbors or its people, to the Palestinians it occupies, I think that will serve us for decades to come. And the fact that they've seen the mask ripped off, because what our governments have had to do in order to maintain this fucking unconscionable position is to remove the mask, right? Your argument is so much easier to make, no? Now, a year later than it was before October 7th, of our governments being a puppet to the United States or whatnot. This is inarguable now. It's on display for everybody. So you can't really put that back in the box. They will try.
Well,
statescraft will try to distance itself from this from years
yeah,
to come.
I agree with all of that, 100%. People will not unsee what they have seen, and what they have seen is horrible beyond their worst nightmares. My point is simply that whatever the long-term impacts of these protests will be on public opinion and political behavior, it doesn't seem to be having any impact on governments within the time frame needed to stop the genocide. And it's not having impact on them within the time frame needed to stop the escalation of this war. There's no indication it's changed. So long-term, will many good things come from this? Yeah, I agree with that. But in the near term, which is what we ought to be concerned about the most, it's unfortunately not going to be the protests that are going to save the Palestinian people. It's going to be the resistance that's going to save the Palestinian people, and it will save them. And the other thing I want to say is that there is a benefit to these protests, whatever impact it's having on our governments. And it's a very important benefit. And that is, it gives hope to the Palestinian people. Imagine how dispiriting it is to be suffering what they're suffering and to feel as though the world doesn't care. When we go into the streets and they see us protesting, it gives them strength. Even if our depraved, psychopathic politicians continue to ignore our just demands, it gives them strength. So that, in and of itself, is a very, very important reason to protest.
That's such a good point, because that's something I think we forget about. And I think after all this time, like we're seeing the numbers dwindle, because it's hard to keep the energy going. It's hard to not let yourself become numb and to become normalized to the images that we're seeing. But remembering and connecting it to something like that, to something real, a real change, is such an important reminder.
Yeah, and Palestinians, you can see that they say this. They say, thank you for showing us that you haven't forgotten us, that you care. That means so much to us. And it means that as much to the Lebanese people. So stay in the streets. I say that to all of our comrades. Keep fighting. But I believe that what's going to bring this to a just end is going to be the resistance at the end of the day, and not the conscience of our leaders, because I just don't think they have any.
And that's just another reminder why folks cannot back down from supporting the resistance and the right to armed resistance, because that has not been an easy thing to do since October 7th, with the way media frames it and the way that our governments frame armed resistance as terrorism, but to understand the occupation and the ways out of it. But still, it's always safer, right? You always have a bigger catch if you just leave that out of the discussion, right? The right to resist. If we could just yell ceasefire over and over and over again, everything will be okay. But from day one, we've been emphasizing the need to remind people that no, armed resistance is still a legal, rational response to what is happening to the people of Palestine and what's happening to the people of Lebanon. And to deny and to remove that language from how we speak, it starts to diminish its legitimacy overall, right? And it gives all that more room to Trudeau and the like to then treat Hezbollah and Hamas like terrorists and to use their might against them, which would be unimaginable, but totally a scenario that we could see as we watch the U.S., protect Israel yet again. So, yeah, I appreciate you kind of holding that point, because it's not a friendly one. It's not a popular one, but it's a necessary one.
It's indispensable. We have to stress over and over again that the people have a right to resist their oppression and their destruction by arms if necessary, within the bounds of the rules of war, of course. That they must be respected to the extent that they can be, but are they required to passively submit to their own destruction? I mean, it's obscene to suggest that that's the case, and we shouldn't be ashamed about saying so. We need to change the way people think about resistance to oppression. We've allowed this terrorist narrative, which is so ridiculous, because the biggest terrorist in the world is the U.S. government, by far, by a wide margin. we've allowed this to become embedded in people's minds, and it affects tremendously how they view what's happening right now in West Asia. So I think there should be a priority from an advocacy perspective to talk about the right to armed resistance, and to do so courageously and knowledgeably and not be afraid.
And you think that would be obvious by now, but I think as we come up to the anniversary of October 7th and events that will mark that time, there's a hesitancy to have it on October 7th itself. There's a hesitancy to use the word resist. I'm seeing in a lot of smaller organizations and the events that they're going to have vigils. A lot of vigils are planned for a year in, and the word resistance is in fact missing from the correspondence all of a sudden, from the posters. Not all of them, but there's a marked difference than what we would have seen 2 months ago, because people are starting to get sensitive about talking about this day and what happened on October 7th and the whatnot. And that's something we unpacked in our last episode. So we're not going to do that again. But, it's in these moments, just like it was a year ago, extra important when people are even more afraid to acknowledge that horrors did happen on October 7th, but it wasn't the act of armed resistance that was unconscionable, that could be labeled as terrorism. And you don't need to make that concession just because it's on the anniversary of that date. Thank you so much, Dimitri, for, continuing to do your work, especially hopping on a plane on October 8th to go to Beirut. That's pretty fire. I didn't know that. Made for a very interesting kind of perspective there over that year, and taking the time to share it with us.
No worries. I would like to comment on the Elizabeth May thing before I go.
Totally. We'll use this as a soundbite or something. Yeah. She was spitting fire in the House of Commons. That's not something you would have got away with in the Green Party.
Yeah, no kidding. Absolutely. And I think she got booed for her tame remarks. So Elizabeth May, I have a long and painful history of interactions with Elizabeth May on the question of Palestine. And I will tell you that she has made it's a kind of, realpolitik Machiavellian decision to frame her criticisms of the Israeli apartheid regime in a particular way, which she thinks immunizes her, or at least reduces to a manageable level the blowback from the Israel lobby. And the way she does that, as I'm sure you've guessed, I see you're nodding, I know what's going through your mind, is she makes it all about Netanyahu. Oh, if only they got rid of Netanyahu. Okay? So, or, she might even add in, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich too. They got to get rid of those guys. But
she won't say Zionism, right?
Exactly.
She won't say the occupation.
Absolutely. She won't say apartheid. She actually opposes BDS. She went on this curated tour of the West Bank, which I understand was managed by the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas. And she keeps saying over and over again, they told me don't support BDS because it harms the Palestinians. And I said, who told you that? The Palestinian Authority told you that? The ones who actually go and arrest resistance fighters and torture their own people? The corrupt people told you that? So she's very carefully navigating a path through treacherous waters, which she thinks allows her to maintain legitimacy with the base of the party and progressives generally, who are overwhelmingly sympathetic to the Palestinian people and very critical of Israel, and at the same time keep herself firmly ensconced in the mainstream. So she makes it all about Netanyahu. Okay, this is actually doing
because you're even free to do that in Israel, right?
Sure.
He is just a political figure. Not they all, but the occupation is kind of put aside from even the hostage situation, and all of that is then aside from the general situation in Israel, right? Where you take economic and all of these other factors of politics into account, right? So that's easy for her to make, even in a room full of Zionists. She can say this.
Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Party leader in the Senate, like a fanatical Zionist, the U.S. senator, said months ago, Netanyahu has to go. He said that. Okay. Of course, he didn't mean it, but he was prepared to say it publicly. Right. So this is BS. How did Netanyahu end up being in power for so long? Israeli Jews voted him in. It wasn't the Palestinians who supported him, Palestinian citizens of Israel, I assure you. It was the Israeli Jewish population kept voting him in, voting him in, voting him in. Who's giving him the weapons to do what he's doing? It's the Biden administration. If you're not prepared to talk about the fact that Israel is a profoundly racist society and the United States is enabling this genocide and in fact encouraging it in many ways, you're not helping the Palestinian people. And you can stand up in parliament and scream at the top of your lungs and, tears can start flowing out of your eyes. It's all just kabuki theater. Okay, you have to diagnose the problem. And she's not prepared to do that because if she does, she's going to take serious heat from the Israel lobby. So there, I got that off my chest. I had to say that.
I'm so glad. Because I did promise you, I thought I was warning you, we're going to ask you about your old nemesis, Elizabeth May, and you'd be like, oh, all right. But no, your eyes lit up. You're like, yeah. Bring it.
I don't regard her as a nemesis. I regard her as a pathetic figure who should
Did I elevate her status there too much?
she's
I'm
not.
Sorry.
I do not regard her or actually anybody in Parliament as a nemesis. I'm ashamed of these people. Every single one of them, with a couple of exceptions, and one of them I'm going to name, Nikki Ashton. I'm not ashamed of Nikki Ashton. Okay, Nikki Ashton's a friend of mine. I may not like her party. I may not agree with Nikki on every way she approaches these issues, but I think she's a fundamentally good person. She's not the only one. There's a few others. Okay, but most of them are simply an embarrassment. And that's the way we should view them. We need to disempower these people because it's not just the Palestinians who are going to be finished off. We'll all be finished off if we're led in the long run by people like these.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.